Brian Rosenthal here. I'm the host of the Fit Growth Machine podcast. And today I'm going to interview the person who cracked the leadership codes of Starbucks, Airbnb, Mercedes-Benz USA, and many other top companies. So this is a really interesting one. But before introducing today's guest, let me tell you that this episode is brought to you by BSR Digital. At BSR Digital, we help e-commerce brands that want to scale their business to the next level through Facebook, Instagram, and Google Ads. BSR Digital knows that most e-commerce brands want to grow their sales, but they lack a solid plan and professional team to help them succeed. That's why BSR Digital offers strategic plans, implementation, optimization, and account audits to help more than 1,000 e-commerce brands like yours grow their businesses and surpass their competitors. And today, since you are a listener of the Fit Growth Machine podcast, we are offering a free audit. And that's right, it's a free ad account audit, free of charge, to help you identify areas of opportunities to keep growing your e-commerce brand. To get your free ad account audit, you can visit us at bsrdigital.com and you will see a button to apply there. And you can also email us at hello@bsrdigital.com. Okay, now, as promised, today I have a great guest. His name is Joseph Michelli. He's a speaker, New York Times bestselling author, and the CEO at the Michelli Experience. Hey, Joseph, thanks for being on the show.
Great being with you, Brian. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, my pleasure. And before we get started, I would like to give a shout out to Jeremy Wise, who made the intro. Great guy. So thank you, Jeremy. Okay, so the first question I have for you, it's usually something I do pretty often when I interview someone, because I'm really curious about their story and how they get to where they are at currently. So what's yours?
Well, I'm an incredibly lucky human being. I was thrown in a trash can at 3 days of age. That's really a great start to saying how lucky I
Wow.
am, right? Yeah, an unwanted pregnancy found by a police officer as I was screaming, I think, from the trash can, and everything goes great from there on out. I was adopted to a wonderful, loving home. Blue collar folks, no one in my family had gone to college. I'd gotten a scholarship from an incredible benefactor out of Chicago who gave me the opportunity to go to college. And from there, just a number of other wonderful people have nurtured me along my career to get a doctorate at USC and work with some amazing brands on their journey to customer experience excellence, and then writing some of the books about the companies with whom I've consulted.
Wow, that's quite a story. I imagine. So yeah. So yeah. So moving forward to today's date, um, I mean, you have written many books. You're a best-selling author, and I said before that you have cracked the leadership code of many companies. And in your latest book, in fact, you talk more accurately about the pandemic, right? So it was a tough period for everyone. Like I'm a dad, I always say, of 3-year-old twins. So the pandemic was no easy for me, but it was no easy for anyone. And it wasn't easy either for leaders, right? Company leaders. So, I mean, there are many things involved, like resilience and lessons learned from the adversity of the past couple of years. So what can you say about that? What did you find out in a nutshell by interviewing those hundreds of top leaders?
Yeah, one of the things that happened for me is that I wasn't planning on writing a book about a lot of top leaders surviving the pandemic. I wasn't ready for the pandemic any more than anyone else. I was writing a book at the time about Godiva chocolate. We were in 2020 looking to 2021, which would have been the 95th anniversary of a brand founded in 1926. And so actively working on that, I'd consulted for Godiva chocolate. I'd also worked with a new CEO when she used to be working at Starbucks. So it was just a perfect time for me to come in and write a book about this storied brand. And they were doing some really innovative things. They were starting to open up stores in high street locations that were going head to head against Starbucks as a cafe. So oftentimes you think of Godiva as chocolate in your in your supermarket, or at a high-end store, or in the mall they have their own stores. But this was really going to be a cafe environment, and so was working on that. And then next thing, that closed down, and the manufacturing plants that I was going to visit got closed down. And my clients, who are trying to improve customer experience and engagement of their team members, were starting to reach out to me in droves in 2020, just basically saying, hey, look, we're just trying to survive here. So I'm on all these task forces with my clients, and it became pretty clear to me that leaders, no matter how good they were struggling to figure out how they were going to survive this thing, and if they could come out on the backside stronger than they came in. And so I just started listening to them, and before you know it, we had a book with a lot of folks, mostly C-suite leaders from around the globe on really recognizable brands, that had participated in this discussion of the lessons that they were learning and the mistakes they were making as they tried to navigate the challenges of the pandemic.
Wow, yeah, that's super interesting. And correct me if I'm wrong, but that book was released late 2020, December 2020.
Yeah, I've never put a book together as rapidly as
Yeah,
that, nor
you
my
moved fast.
publisher. My publisher normally takes 6 months from the time they accept the manuscript to turn it around. I think they did it in 6 weeks. It was a labor of love, and a percentage of the proceeds from Stronger Through Adversity, which is the title of that book, goes to Direct Relief, which is a nonprofit organization that helps those in the pandemic, and really helps in any crisis situation globally. So it was meant to be one of the things that we could do to give people real time insights, as well as a resource that we could use to give back to all those who are giving so much for us.
And in a nutshell, what did you identify there? Of course, everyone should go and read the book, but in a nutshell, because I imagine that, the, what is it called? Like the Maslow pyramid? Is that
Yeah,
correct, right? So,
Maslowian, yeah, definitely right. The Maslowian hierarchy of needs. There's
yeah,
definitely a lot of validation for that, and without a doubt, safety became supreme, right? So if you think in a Maslowian sense, the
yeah.
basic needs of food and survival, physical safety and security, those kind of things were really prominent, and they took a higher priority. If you think about it, just on that topic alone, most of the time people in business, leaders, are thinking of themselves as creating positive opportunities in the lives of their people as part of the social contract between the employer and the employee. During the pandemic, the social contract was one where the employee put themselves at risk for death on behalf of a brand. And it was the first time I think a lot of leaders thought about the high risk stakes of their team just doing their job. So, yeah, in terms of lessons, there are 21 of them. So it'd be a big nutshell, but there were 21 different lessons that we culled out of these massive number of interviews. But I think some of the most primary ones are the fact that leaders, particularly early on, were not taking care of themselves very well. They were running on adrenaline. They were not sleeping. They were not exercising. They weren't getting up from their desk. I think one of the great examples from the book is one of Stacy Salvi. And Stacy at the time was just a big leader at Fitbit. And she said, it's bad when a company like Fitbit has their executives like me needing our devices to tell us to get up and walk around. We were not even getting up and moving because we were looking for ways to use our device to be able to track whether or not you'd had contact with somebody who was infected. And we're in such important projects with Stanford Medical School that we couldn't even think to get up. And this is a company that tries to encourage us to be more active. So I think you saw a lot of leaders needing to really take care of themselves. You saw a lot of leaders needing to figure out, how do I reach out to others? I've operated as if I have all the answers, and now I don't even know the questions. How do they reach out effectively within their network and outside of their own industry in order to get insights on how to manage the crisis? So those are some of the preliminary beginning foundational pieces. And then we just, there are 19 other lessons in there about how to be adaptive in your leadership style, and a variety of other things I think that are important.
Yeah, I mean, it was a very confusing period for everyone, because it was like, first, okay, 2 weeks, then 2 weeks, then 2 weeks, and it was like, depending on where you live, it's like it was step by step, because nobody knew, not even governments, how this was going to end. I mean, it
Well, and the
has
governments were actually in opposition with each other, state, local, national governments. If you
exactly.
operated a company that was in multiple countries, then you're dealing with very different approaches to the pandemic. So it was fascinating. And you saw groups, there's a group in Seattle, for example, that included the Microsofts and the Nordstroms and the Starbucks. And just those groups came together, even though their industries were not at all related. And someone like a Nordstrom's, which is only a US based company, was learning lessons from Starbucks as Starbucks was getting early indicators based on things that were happening in China, even before we saw cases in the US. So it was fascinating to see how coalitions got developed and realizing that, in the words of the great poet John Donne, no man is an island. No business is an
Yep.
island, and leaders needed to find ways to put their arms together and look for solutions that would raise all the boats in this really terrible storm that they were on.
Yeah, 100%. And as we already said, the pandemic was really hard on everyone. It was for the young leaders, but what about the senior leaders? I mean, I cannot imagine even for them how challenging this whole thing was.
Yeah, it's interesting. It was different challenges for senior leaders versus younger leaders. Oftentimes, the senior leaders felt like they had to know more because they were senior leaders, but they were as confused about how to approach this. You know, you can say, "Oh, I'm pulling from my experience," but there were very few experiences that lined up against the pandemic. And that's not to say that, you know, if you went through the economic downturn of 2008, you didn't learn some lessons about whether or not to invest or to hold close on your funding. But there was never the same alignment of circumstances as what we saw during the pandemic. So I think senior leaders sometimes felt like they should know more when they couldn't. And then young leaders, I think, were maybe more comfortable with technologies as digital natives as opposed to digital aliens. But I think in some ways they were trying to figure out, how do you lead a team on a digital platform? So it was very, very fascinating to watch from all standpoints. And I think that the key and the main thing behind the book is that I'd hate to think that we went through all of that and we don't come out better than we did before. I mean, it would be really tragic if we went through all of that, all of the suffering, all the loss of life, all the anguish, all the economic uncertainty, and as leaders, we did not make the world a better place. So the goal of the book was to simply try to look at the journey, cull out some of the big lessons, including things like transparency, the willingness to be more vulnerable as a leader, more authentic, something that Brene Brown has been encouraging leaders to do for the longest time. But you really saw more of it out of necessity. You know, when you can't run a meeting from your boardroom and you have to do a Zoom call from your bedroom, there's a natural, you know, layer of a vulnerability that you don't necessarily have. So I hope we come out stronger. And most of the brands that I am talking about in this book are doing really well post pandemic. And some of them really, I mean, had very different challenges. If you take a, you know, president of Marriott who I interviewed, they were facing layoffs and downsizing and closing of properties. And then if you look at some of the technology companies like Microsoft and their Teams product, the president of Microsoft, who was responsible for Teams, they couldn't scale up fast enough, and they weren't ready for their product to be deployed at that speed to their customer base. So it was fascinating to watch all kinds of challenges and hopefully emerging stronger as a result.
Do you think smaller companies benefited from this because they could move faster or not?
If they leverage their nimbleness, right? I mean, the key here is that every brand has its liabilities and its strengths, and whether or not you leverage them effectively at this time. Sometimes size and scale is a real powerful tool for you to have, but the liability often is you can't make a decision without 50 committees involved. And I think there were some very big companies that scrapped the traditional way they made decisions, and they operated from a crisis model, which was much more of, what do we need to get done today? How can we be lean and mean and execute against that without the normal standard processes of getting in the way? So if you were nimble and you could do that, but some of these smaller companies also hadn't put enough infrastructure in to create the safety and security they needed for a longer financial success run. They'd invested so much money in, they were not financially prudent or fiscally capable of generating profits beforehand. And now, if you didn't have that ship tightened up, you could be in trouble as well. So I don't know that one did better than the other. If you were a small company like Zoom, you did really, really well, right?
Oh yeah,
But now there's been a reaction back against that.
I
So it's not quite as successful as it was in the middle of the pandemic.
Yeah, and I know this is not something that we are, let's say, meant to discuss today, or it's not the core of the topics. But I'm curious because it's something trending nowadays, which is people being asked to go back to work in their offices, and a lot of big brands and big names that you mentioned and more are just saying, "Hey, come back," and people are saying no, and probably they are, I don't know, quitting their job and going to a smaller startup to work remote or whatever. So, do you think that's a trend that will continue over the years, or do you think it's a th-
The genie is out of the bottle. There's a couple of things that happened during the pandemic, right? We have realized that employees are far more important to an organization than they might have been treated before. And I literally used to have brand leaders say, "What's more important, a customer or a team member?" Right? And there'd be these big debates. I think people who were on the fence or people who might have thought the customer is most important had a rethinking of it because without the employee, there were no customers. And employees put themselves in a lot of precarious positions in many industries to make it happen. And they were amazingly innovative and they were incredibly productive no matter where they were. We saw productivity increase, even though people had thought the only way you could have productivity is if people sat next to each
yeah,
other in
yeah,
cubicles. So that created a change. And I don't think people ever can go back to that, right? Like that genie is out of the bottle now, and we have tasted what it's like to work from home. So that's there. I think you're seeing more efforts to try to create hybrid workplaces. And I think that the sense that comes from this is that you can do a lot more from your home than we ever envisioned. We want you to have the comfort and the lifestyle that enables you to have those freedoms and do the things that you were able to do. At the same time, most brands were struggling to come up with that cultural connection or innovation and cross pollination. And just there's nothing replacing the ability to get together once in a while as a team to be able to engage and problem solve and be creative. So I think you're seeing brands really trying to figure out what's the sweet spot of that, knowing that all of us experience what I call the great repurposing of our lives. I mean, what is the purpose that I live my life around? And I think you saw that for brands, you saw that for customers. Customers don't necessarily just say, "I'm going to keep going with Netflix every month just because I always have." They're very intentional and purposeful about do I choose that or do I choose another streaming service or where am I going to spend my money and where do I want to live and what job do I really want to do? So you're seeing it on the employee side as well.
so are you saying that uh, both, like, well, customers, leaders, as well as companies are probably more, let's say, meaningful or relevant if they have a purpose, if they have, let's say, a soul, or if they stand for something? Now more than
Absolutely.
ever.
I've always believed that even long before the pandemic, maybe more so during the pandemic, we did see some consumer shift of going toward brands that had more of a clear purpose that they could identify, particularly if that purpose brought back into their own community. So there's no doubt about that, right? I think the bigger issue is that people were not on autopilot anymore about what was important to them. So, we made a lot of choices just out of habit before the pandemic, and then our habits got disrupted. And as soon as they got disrupted, we had the opportunity to say, okay, now that I can't do it the way I've always done it, what do I really want to do? And I think that's where you're seeing people saying, hey, I don't want to live in a city. I want to live in the rural area. Hey, I don't necessarily want to work for this job. It was the first job out of college and I stayed in that career path, but I really have a passion for this. So I'm going to jump over and do what I have a passion for. And consumers the same. Is this brand represent something that connects with what I value? And so they're making even more purchase intent driven on the core soul of a brand.
That's great. So I know that long before the pandemic, you also interviewed a lot of leaders, and that's what I was saying at the beginning of the episode, that you cracked the leadership codes of many companies such as Starbucks, Airbnb, Mercedes, USA, and in fact, you have released books around those. So I have a question for you about that. Is like, why do you say that great leaders do to build sustainable brands mainly?
Yeah, I think, my good fortune has been that I got to work with these leaders as a consultant to help them increase the quality of the experiences they provide internally and externally. So I don't know if I had cracked their code, but I got the chance to work alongside of them. And right now, for example, Howard Schultz is back again as the CEO of Starbucks, and someone that I worked with in an early time where I wrote a book about them called The Starbucks Experience. And again, later when he transformed the company, when he came back after the 2008 timeframe as their leader. So he's been an interim and out and in and out. And he's back again. And now he's trying to crack the code, if you will, to use that phrase, on how do we create a work environment that doesn't give too much to the shareholders and gives more back to the frontline team members in a way that decreases unionization efforts as a strategy to protect the worker. So, yeah, I mean, I think what I see among great leaders is they do have an authentic vision for how to make the world a better place. They share that vision in a charismatic enough way. I worked with Tony Hsieh, who's the deceased CEO of Zappos. He died in kind of a tragic way last year around Thanksgiving. And he was not as charismatic outwardly in the sense of he could, get up on stage and rally the troops with an impassioned speech, but he had an authentic sense of wanting to do good in the world. And he got people very invested in following and pursuing that, aligned with that vision. So I think it always starts with a compelling vision. It starts with the ability to make a connection with your team members, to show them that that's where you want to take an organization, and ask them if they would like to enroll in that vision with you to make the world better than they would have been able to make it had they not joined in NOS. And then I think past that, it's all the classic sorts of things of really treating the people that you serve the same way you expect them to serve others. So having that servant leadership in keeping with your vision for the world. I think there is a great amount of accountability in these brands when they're successful. And sometimes we forget about the importance of accountability. We think about how important it is to be compassionate. There's no doubt about that, but we don't always assert the need for people to not just be compassionate and self-focused, but they need to really be able to produce results on behalf of others. And they make it clear, they use their metrics, they challenge people, they reward those who do well, and they help people who aren't a fit move on to other places where they might have a better fit, so they don't hold on to people who are not able to advance the vision.
And do they, just curious, do they follow any well-known, um, let's say, operating system, like, I don't know, 4DX or EOS, or do they have their own version of it, or
I think I
OKR?
think I've seen the leaders I've worked with follow everyone you just mentioned. Some one, another, and then for the most part, in the end, it isn't a purist model ever. It's almost always the best of these various things hybrided into their own operating system.
Awesome. Yeah, but definitely they need to measure, they need to track. That's why those companies are super big and they achieve the results they achieve. So yeah, that's awesome.
I think when you
So
get at scale, it becomes even more important, right? I mean, it's so hard. It's not hard to run a small operation and know everybody and have the chit chats and conversations. And it's another thing when you're a global 24/7, 365 company, speaking many languages with all kinds of governmental restrictions and in all types of territories. So you got
yeah,
to
and
really be
cultures,
able to.
values, and yeah, I mean, it must be super hard. Um, so yeah, I like to always finish the conversations asking the guest about favorite books they have, or if they had any mentors. So in your case, besides your own books, which we're going to mention in the sec, do you have any favorite books that you have read?
Oh yeah, I think I got started in my career thanks to The Experience Economy by Gilmore and Pine. James Gilmore, Joe Pine. Got to know them since. It's always amazing. All of John Maxwell's books have been really instrumental to me. At one point, John read one of my books and wrote a review of it, and I was crying. I was just literally crying to think that all these years I've read him, and to think that he ever took a moment to read mine. Yeah, I mean, beyond the businessy kind of books like that, though, or leadership books, I tend to read books outside of the area and just kind of remind myself about human potential and human service. So, A Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl is one of my favorite books. I read it every few years. I read Will Durant's History of Civilization about every 10 years. It's a compilation of about 10 books, so it takes a while to get through. But it always reminds me of the Newton line, Isaac Newton saying, "We stand on the shoulders of giants," and just remind us that if it weren't for so many other people, we wouldn't be where we are today. We should be humble about that, and we need to think about how will we set the world up when we're no longer around.
Yeah. Yeah. Everyone listening, this will be in the show notes so we can actually get them from there. So what about mentors or advisors? Do you have any?
Everybody I've worked with has been a mentor of mine. One of the great ones that I started out in my career with was a guy by the name of Johnny Yokoyama. Johnny retired as the president the president of the world famous Pike Place Fish Market in Seattle, Washington. Small little fish market, 1,200 square feet of retail space in Elliott Bay. He was remarkable at transforming a culture from a negative one to a more positive one. He did a lot of work on himself as a leader, and he sold his business to his own team, even though he would have made more money if he sold it outside of his team, just because he was committed to the people who he had helped develop to make a great difference in the world.
That's great. Before we wrap up, is there anything I didn't ask you that you think that might benefit the audience?
No, and thank you so much for this. I appreciate what you do and how you help brands and leaders be better, and certainly help them traverse the challenges of e-commerce and the like.
Yeah, I appreciate that. So where can people go to learn more about you and your businesses?
Well, I'm shamelessly all over the internet. If you can spell my name, you can find me. My Twitter handle is the same as my first and last name. I'm that same on LinkedIn, and my website is also the same name. So it's josephmichelli.com.
Okay, we'll include them in the show notes as well. Okay, Joseph, it was a pleasure to have you. Thank you for sharing all your thoughts and experience here.
Thank you, Brian. It's an honor to be here.